Yes. So this is your copy.
I left that here.
Okay.
It shows.
This is yours. Yeah. Oh, yes, I'll write it in a minute.
You want to ask people to move?
Yeah, a couple more seats up front here.
Stuff that they have because they what they've held back, understandably, is anything that has a sort of a really secret. Not that in Narrow's case, I would expect there'd be anything very very dramatic, but anything that had to do with.
Everybody could move to the
any kind
center
of link
so
with
that
espionage.
easier to
The
get
training
to
they
see.
were all given in various sort of basic intelligence techniques, all that, so far as I know, is left out of records of the Lenin School that have been open. Yes. Oh, do. This is excellent. I mean, you can. No, this would be excellent. Now, provided that you come during term time, I'm more or less guaranteed to be there. Yes. I mean, no, I'm impressed. I mean, you should do Churchill as well while you're at it. Yes. Shall I go and? No. Okay. Right. Yeah. Good.
We'll get started.
There isn't a clock around that I'm not noticing, is there? Okay, so I'll take my watch off. No, that would be excellent. Yes. I should have thought that was one of the understatements of the afternoon. Yes. Okay.
A couple more seats up front here. If you'd like to join us. Okay. Meanwhile, we'll get started. There'll be a few stragglers. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, my name is Christian Osterman. I'm the director of the History and Public Policy program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I also direct the program's Cold War International History Project. And on behalf of the center and my colleagues here, I'd very much like to welcome you to this Cold War seminar, which is co-sponsored with the Kennan Institute for Russian Studies at the Wilson Center. The center, known to many of you, of course, is the official U.S. memorial to Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, as an institute for advanced studies in the humanities and social sciences. The center tries to bridge the world of policy and the world of ideas, tries to facilitate dialogue between the scholarly and the public policy community here in Washington. Directed by former Congressman Lee Hamilton, the center hosts about 150 scholars on an annual basis, as well as over 400 meetings on international and national affairs. The center's History and Public Policy program seeks to provide historical context to some of the public policy issues of today and those of tomorrow. The program's Cold War International History Project has for more than a decade now spearheaded a global effort to unlock and disseminate new documents and perspectives on the history of the Cold War, in particular from previously inaccessible archives of what we used to call the other side, the former communist world. We have done quite a bit of work, as many of you know, in Russia and Eastern Europe. More recently, we've started to move into new directions, such as China and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. We publish the QIP Bulletin of newly declassified and translated documents. Next issue is forthcoming. The last issue is available outside. And all of our documents and other materials can be downloaded from our website. That is our virtual archive, which you can find at CWIHP for Cold War International History Project.org. In addition to locating, translating, publishing documents, we organize international meetings on aspects of the Cold War. We host a small fellowship program for junior scholars here at the center. Good way to keep in touch, keep up to date on our activities is our free listserv. If you're interested, I encourage you to go to our website. There's an easy way there to just sign up online for our listserv, and occasionally you'll get an invitation or an update on a new publication by the project. We also try to provide a forum in the heart of Washington for the discussion of new, important, and relevant findings and publications, such as The World Was Going Our Way, the KGB and the Battle for the Third World, newly released Secrets from the Mitrokhin Archive by Professor Christopher Andrew and Vasily Mitrokhin. And it is my distinct pleasure and honor to have Professor Andrew with us here today, as well as Professor Sunil Khilnani, who will open the discussion by way of some initial comments. I will introduce them in turn shortly. Let me briefly mention that we had hoped, of course, that Vasily Mitrokhin could be with us here today on the occasion of the launch of the second volume, but sadly he did not live to see the publication of his volume. I had the great fortune and privilege of meeting Mr. Mitrokhin some years ago. Chris, of course, knows him far better, but let me just say that Mr. Mitrokhin was in many ways an inspiring person. What impressed me most was his concern for present-day Russia and his passion for the importance of these materials that he brought out of Russia, and his passion for making them accessible and available to scholars, not just an English-speaking audience, but especially a Russian audience. Altogether, these materials comprise what the FBI has characterized as the most complete and extensive intelligence ever received from any source. Most of these materials consist of notes which Mitrokhin had copiously assembled over several years while he worked in the archives of the KGB First Chief Directorate in Yasenovo, outside of Moscow. Mitrokhin had moved from the operational side of the KGB to the archives in the mid-1950s, where it was his job to respond to requests by other departments. Influenced by the bloody suppression of the Prague Spring in 1968 and the dissident movement, all of which he could follow through the files he administered, as well as Western records, Mitrokhin became increasingly disaffected with the KGB. By the early 70s, he had decided to compile his own account of the KGB's foreign operations, a project that became feasible when he was put in charge in 1972 of the movement of the archives from the KGB's headquarters at Lubyanka to in central Moscow to Yasenevo, southwest of the capital. In charge of checking, compiling, indexing the records in the process of the transfer, which began in 1974, I believe, Mitrokhin soon conceived of the idea to create his own archive. Starting in 1977, he used every opportunity to take notes of documents he saw. Working in complete secrecy, he first took these notes in longhand while working in the archives, and later, once safely in his dacha, sorted and transcribed them. Not until 1992 did he manage to get the materials and his family safely out of the country. Fortunately, we have Vasily Mitrokhin's co-author here today, Professor Christopher Andrew. He needs no introduction to this audience. He's widely recognized as the preeminent scholar, yes, the Dean of Intelligence History. Professor Andrew is Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at Cambridge University, a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a former visiting Professor of National Security at Harvard University, and he has been a guest lecturer at the CIA and American universities, other American universities, as well as he's the author of numerous books on the world of covert intelligence, including, and these are just a couple of samples, For the President's Eyes Only, Secret Intelligence in the American Presidency from Washington to Bush, KGB, The Inside Story of its Foreign Operations from Lenin to Gorbachev, co-authored with Oleg Gordievsky, and most recently, of course, The Sword and the Shield, the Mitrokhin Archive and the Secret History of the KGB, the first volume, co-authored with Vasily Mitrokhin. Chris, it's an honor and great pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to your talk. Thanks very much.
Well, it is a great pleasure to be here. In front of this distinguished audience, I dare use a distinction which I didn't use on several chat shows this morning. That is to say, the distinction between histoire événementielle and longue durée. So let me begin with histoire événementielle, and I will get round pretty quickly to the longue durée. This book almost didn't happen. And the reason that it almost didn't happen is that it took an extraordinary slice of good fortune for Mitrokhin to get his material to the West. He'd got this extraordinary archive. He'd never worked out how exactly to make it public. But when the Soviet Union fell apart, then there was the opportunity to get it to one of the Baltic republics. He took an overnight train. The picture for the first time, which was taken by the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, which the media usually calls MI6, is published in the book for the first time. What does it show? It shows a vagrant, or somebody who looks like a vagrant. It shows a street person, and there was a very good reason for dressing as a vagrant. He wanted to attract as little attention as possible from the Russian border guards as he crossed from Russia into one of the Baltic republics, carrying, or rather dragging behind him, a battered case on wheels in which he had put samples of the documents at the bottom, and then, as I suppose most amateur smugglers would do, dirty underwear on top and various other things, with spiced sausages at the top. I think that would probably deter Her Majesty's customs, but the Russian border guards, being members in those days of the KGB, probably he was lucky. Well, anyway, when he turned up at the American embassy, for very complex reasons, he didn't get very far. Then he turned up at the embassy of Her Britannic Majesty, and he asked to speak to somebody in authority. I hadn't realized that diplomats could be female as well as male, but anyway, a young female diplomat turned up. And he told her his deeply improbable story that at the bottom of this bag there were samples of top-secret material from the KGB. Now, at that point, she could simply have regarded him as yet another bogus asylum seeker manufacturing some way to get a visa, but she didn't. She asked him a question which makes me proud to be British. It's a question which only a British diplomat could ask. It changed his life, and in a smaller way, it changed mine. The question was, would you like a cup of tea? And so while he was having his first ever cup of English tea, because he had intended to defect to the United States rather than to Britain, but it has been the British privilege to sweep up after you from time to time. The name Oleg Penkovsky comes to mind. She looked at this stuff, and she realized that it was genuine. He had had access to the Holy of Holies. What's the Holy of Holies? The records, of course, of the deep cover illegals, and if any of those checked out. those people operating, as parent members of Cambridge University, the Wilson Centre, and I don't actually know any example in those two institutions, but and their real identities and their legends and so on. So she set up a meeting a few weeks later with the Secret Intelligence Service, which didn't actually have a base in that embassy at that time. And then they pulled off on the 75th anniversary of the Great October Revolution, the extraordinary feat of exfiltrating Mitrokhin and his family and his entire archive to Britain, which is where 3 years later I saw it. Now, Christian was describing his passion. The thing that none of us will, I think, ever completely understand is what motivated the most passionate of the Russian dissidents. And Mitrokhin was fundamentally a dissident. He just happened to be within the KGB. But his ideological commitment to what he was doing is, I think, the easiest thing to establish about him. I mean, if for 12 years in the first instance, but then really during the 8 remaining years before he was exfiltrated, he puts his life on the line every day, risks a secret trial, sentence for guilty, quick walk to the execution chamber, a bullet in the back of the head. None of us would ever have heard of him. I don't think we need bother about establishing the seriousness of his motivation, and also the idea that he was doing it for money in the United States or Britain. Deeply improbable, but if you knew, as I do, the London restaurants that he chose to go to, we are being televised, so I would like to say that the Stockpot restaurant is a very fine series of London restaurants. It's just that I wouldn't go so far as to recommending that you go there next time you're in London. So why did he do it? Well, I mean, the first thing I think to realize is we're never going to be able to explain why he and the other dissidents, whether open, Sakharov, Ratushinskaya, secret, Gordievsky, Mitrokhin, in any terms that are familiar to us. So here's a category that I started with. Those Russian authors, some of the greatest Russian authors of the Soviet era, which of course means some of the greatest authors of the 20th century, their ability to give over a good part of their lives to writing in secret works which they knew or believed, and they were right to believe, were works of genius, while at the same time accepting the fact that they could not be published in their lifetime and would probably not be published in any lifetime. I mean, asking a British author, asking an American author how you think your way into that position is just not possible. But just a couple of examples. A reasonable nomination for the greatest Russian writer of the 20th century is Mikhail Bulgakov. Now, again, by general, if not universal agreement, his greatest work is The Master and Margarita. He wrote that work in secret over 12 years, 1928 to 1940. His wife has credibly described how when he was on his deathbed, he made her get him out of bed one last time, saw that the Master and Margarita was still in the hole in the wall, went back to his bed and died. And 25 years later, as nobody could have predicted, it did actually see the light of day. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, one of the greatest egos in the history of 20th century literature. I don't know why I limit it to 20th century. No. The idea that he could devote his genius, and he would certainly agree with the use of that word, to writing material which might never be published, is again, I think, really beyond the comprehension of those of us who live and write in the West. All that we can do is to recognize that there is a commitment to writing, to telling the truth as it's seen, which has inspired a whole series of writers, even if it's not something we can completely empathize with. But when Solzhenitsyn was writing One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, he knew once, he thought that this might not be able to be published in his lifetime. So as he says in his autobiography, he couldn't write at all until he'd overcome what is kind of writer's block that none of us in the West will ever have to go over, the impossibility of publishing our material for any reason other than that publishers won't take it. So he says, he had to come to terms with the fact that, quote, I must write simply to ensure that it was not forgotten, that posterity might someday come to know of it. Publication in my own lifetime, I must rule out of my mind, out of my dreams. So the first way of attempting to come to terms with what Mitrokhin did is, I think, to accept that we cannot understand it in our own terms. Now, I will not go into any details what he brought to the West. Volume 1 is 1,000 pages. I remember that while I was discussing with Mitrokhin where some of his original material or some of his sole-authored material might be published. We discussed the Cold War International History Project. I showed him some of the publications. That was simply the end of the discussion. The sad news and the good news at the same time is that at the time of his death last year, he had some other material which I think that would have come the way of the Cold War International History Project, and I hope it's in a form, at least the family certainly hopes that it's in a form in which some of it can come here. So I hope that's the case. Now for the longue durée. What I want to try and do is to put this extraordinary haystack of material. By the way, I'm hoping that anybody who is sitting next to somebody who can't hear, or anyway, that there will be signs indicating that I should speak up or move near the microphone. What I want to do is to attempt to put the extraordinary Mitrokhin material in a broader context. One of the major differences between the way that both international relations and contemporary history are written about nowadays and quarter of a century, half a century ago, even more recently than that, is the treatment of intelligence. I mean, there is a tremendous difference, in other words, between the way that we see the events of the early 21st century reported in the newspapers and the way that we see the events of the Cold War analyzed in scholarly literature on the Cold War. In the great conflicts of the early 21st century, 9/11, Afghanistan, and Iraq, intelligence is at center stage. Indeed, the main issue that is debated often seems to reduce itself to just how good the intelligence was. Now, a quarter of a century ago, we all know it wasn't like that at all. There was no equivalent of the 9/11 report in the United States or the September dossier on Iraq, dodgy or not, in the United Kingdom. Half a century ago, even the word intelligence was pretty much taboo on my side of the Atlantic. Now, what I think has not been adequately realized is the very odd and unsatisfactory way that intelligence has been reinserted into our understanding of most of the 20th century. The way that it's been partially reinserted is seriously eccentric, highly unsatisfactory, and one book isn't going to cure it, but I hope that our book has made a modest contribution towards it. So let me begin at the Second World War, because the odd, Monty Python-esque way frequently that intelligence is treated in the history of the Cold War can't be understood, I think, unless one looks at the incredibly lopsidedness of the historiography of the Second World War. Second World War, as we all know, was arguably more influenced by intelligence than any previous conflict. Britain and the United States knew more about their enemies than any powers had ever known at any time in any war. The Soviet Union knew more about its allies than any power had ever known in any war in any place, but rather less about its enemies. The biggest Allied secret was, of course, ultra. Now, here's the problem at the end of the Second World War, and I've just given the British view. British intelligence wanted, if at all possible, for the ultra-secret never to come out at all, and for other powers never to suspect, particularly those who had bought Enigma machines, that their communications might be successfully decrypted. But if you look at what they wrote, and the material is now being declassified, they knew that within a few years historians would have worked it out. How could they do otherwise? Anyone who limited their reading of current affairs to the front pages of American newspapers would have followed the Pearl Harbor inquiry and would have known that the Americans, who were not before the Second World War as advanced as the Brits in cryptanalysis, had broken the main Japanese diplomatic cipher, Purple. And anybody who had got as far as writing a school essay on the entry of the United States into the First World War would have known that the Brits during the First World War were breaking German diplomatic and naval ciphers. The Zimmermann telegram is an example that comes to mind. So essentially what British intelligence thought was, every historian writing on the Second World War knows that the Americans broke purple. Every historian writing on the Second World War knows that the British broke German codes during the First World War. So, is it going to take them as long as a year to work out that we did the same in the Second World War? Well, actually, it took them 30 years, and then even then they didn't work it out. It was worked out for them because the ultra-secret was suddenly declassified, first unofficially and then officially. Then what happens? Overnight, nobody writes any longer, even at the length of an article or a chapter, about the Western Allies' war effort during the Second World War without referring to code breaking. But precisely the same historians who see code breaking as central, it doesn't change the outcome of the war, but it sure as hell changes the timing of the outcome of the Second World War, which makes a considerable difference, for example, on the 6th of August 1945. And they're the same historians who wouldn't dream of writing about the history of the Second World War without mentioning SIGINT, continue in their great majority not even to occur to them that they should include SIGINT in the history of the Cold War. And it wasn't, as we know, for example, since the revelation of Venona. Now, the detail of Venona may not have become declassified till 1996, but the fact that there was a Venona was known or knowable in 1980. Plenty of people who were writing in the late 1980s, early 1990s, like myself, mention it. And even though people can argue about the significance, it's pretty difficult to write about the early Cold War, American political history in the early Cold War, without mentioning it. But I'm not about to attempt to badmouth any of my colleagues. We Now Know is an astonishingly good book, but what we now know in What We Now Know does not actually include anything about code breaking, a word which I believe does not appear in it. So in other words, there's a tremendously lopsided understanding of the role of intelligence in the 30 years, quarter of a century anyway, which follows the revelation of the ultra-secret. Now, there is an almost equally but differently lopsided understanding of HUMINT in the Cold War. Mid-1970s, investigative journalists, good historians, official commissions, Church Committee comes to mind, in the United States, reveal more about what the CIA had been up to over the previous quarter of a century than any group of investigative journalists, historians, official committees had ever revealed about what a major peacetime intelligence agency had been up to. And ever since then, the idea that one could pick up any history of the Cold War without finding episodes like the Bay of Pigs and Make the Economy Scream in Chile and so on mentioned is beyond imagination. But, of course, Russia did not contain a single investigative journalist, a single committee which published its findings on the pattern of the Church Committee. So you get a similar kind of lopsidedness, which is very easy to test. Take the Cold War history of your choice. Look up CIA in the index. It's always there. It may not be comprehensive, it may be more or less accurate, but it's always there. Then look up KGB. Now, the Cold War International History Project, by producing material from the Soviet bloc, I think has begun to change that. And I hope this book takes it a further step. But what we've had, I think, in the secret history of the Cold War, and I invite you to test this proposition by looking up the index of your favorite Cold War history, is the sound of one hand clapping. A secret history of the Cold War, which always contains the CIA. But the KGB was more influential, was up to far more than the CIA, and that's the bit that is usually left out. So the combined efforts, I hope, of Vasily Mitrokhin, myself, the Cold War International History Project, are beginning to produce a secret Cold War history which contains the sound of both hands clapping. For a quarter of a century, the KGB believed that the Cold War was the arena in which it could, so far as making friends and influencing people in the Third World is concerned, win the Cold War. And when one looks at the increasing popularity and the lack of self-confidence of the United States during and after the Vietnam War, one can see that that is not an entirely foolish view. What is striking is that in most, not all, but in most of the main Soviet initiatives in the Third World, it is the KGB, and usually with the support of the International Department, and not the Foreign Ministry, certainly not Andrei Andreevich Gromyko, who is taking the initiative, and Nikolai Leonov, who in many ways starts it by being the first person to spot the potential of Castro. Says the Foreign Ministry and its head, A.A. Gromyko, were openly scornful with regard to the Third World, and that's pretty much what Anatoly Dobrinin, the equally long-serving ambassador in Moscow, says the same. So from the very beginning of the KGB, from the Soviet Union's confidence that the Third World was an arena in which it could beat the United States to the very end, it's the KGB which is taking the initiative. Now, the starting point is perfectly straightforward. It's the extraordinary discovery that the best-looking, the most charismatic young revolutionary of the early 1960s, Fidel Castro, instead of going on to align himself with the New Left, instead of going on to align himself with the Prague Spring, actually finds Leonid Brezhnev somehow preferable to the New Left, somewhere inside that extraordinary man's tortured personality. That problem, I think, is one of the more difficult ones to resolve. But what do we know? We know that Castro, like so many of the people with whom the KGB had contact in Latin America, preferred dealing with the KGB to those boring old Soviet diplomats. And you will recall that the first Soviet ambassador to Havana, Castro couldn't be doing with, and partly as a result of the fact that he couldn't be doing with him, he was replaced as ambassador by the KGB head of station. All kinds of people have found KGB residents more interesting than Soviet diplomats, but that is unfair to quite a number of Soviet diplomats. It's at that point that the KGB makes a crucial change of code word in referring to Cuba. It starts using the word bridgehead, and that is what Cuba is intended to be. Now, you know, it's contacts with Allende, somebody else who preferred dealing with KGB officer Kuznetsov in his case, to the Soviet diplomats, which is something for which Bazov, the ambassador who arrives in Chile in 1972, is not best pleased, the Perón, José Figueres, Omar Torrijos, and others. Well, fast-forwarding, because all the detail is in the book, and I'm not going to go through that. The last major Soviet forward movement in the Third World, the war in Afghanistan. Well, it's not Gromyko, even though he is involved, who is taking the initiative. It is the KGB and the Defense Ministry. But the whole thing begins, and could not begin without, the assassination of President Hafizullah Amin, and that is done by a KGB hit squad, as explained in the material published, amongst others, by the Wilson Center. What I hope to have added from some of the other Mitrokhin material is a little bit more about the fact that they only tried bloodshed once the poisoning had failed. Now, if we think of the position at the end of the 1970s, what is truly astonishing is that a decade before the Berlin Wall comes down, the Soviet Union looks to be in pretty good shape in the Third World. Andropov says to his Vietnamese counterpart when he visits Moscow in 1980, the Soviet Union is not merely talking about revolution in the Third World, it's actually helping it. And of course, he has in mind 3 African states and the Sandinista revolution. CIA doesn't take too different a view. The CIA tells the White House in 1979, quote, Brezhnev and the Soviet leadership can view their position in the world with considerable satisfaction. And 1979 is, of course, the year in which Fidel Castro becomes leader of the non-aligned movement. Non-aligned? I mean, whatever he was, I mean, non-aligned is a deeply unfair description of him. His problem, as we all know, is that when Gorbachev becomes Soviet leader in 1985, he doesn't regard Gorbachev as nearly aligned enough. Amongst the material which Mitrokhin brought out, however, even though Castro is an enormous strategic asset, his ego by 1979 is something which they feel that the Havana station, the Havana residency, can no longer deal with. And they quote a series of complaints from Cuban intelligence, the Cuban Ministry of the Interior, that these senior people, even when all they want to do is to assign an apartment to one of their staff in Havana, they have to get the maximum leader's consent. But still, to quote Karen Brutentz, a quotation which I got from one of the publications of this wonderful Cold War International History Project, the world was going in our direction, or as I have preferred to render it, the world was going our way. A few further thoughts. One of, at first sight, it's a contradiction, but second sight, like so many contradictions, it's pretty obvious. The hardest targets that the KGB had in the developing world during the Cold War were those who were most ideologically aligned. Take Asia. Well, even after the Sino-Soviet split, when China, of course, was going to become a difficult target, the hardest target in Asia, other than North Korea, is Vietnam. So even during the Vietnam War, when the Soviet Union is the most public ally of North Vietnam, later to become United Vietnam, even at a time when it's providing it with most of its weaponry, Vietnam is still unwilling to reveal a significant amount of its secrets to Moscow. So Hanoi is treated as, without it being admitted, a hostile target. The most important Vietnamese agent who is identified in the Mitrokhin material is actually somebody who was recruited when he was stationed at the Vietnamese embassy in Moscow, and who will only communicate with them outside and not inside Vietnam. So democracies, particularly democracies with a strain of corruption running through them, are easier targets. Not to say that what is achieved is of enormous significance, but that is, of course, where India comes in. The idea that the KGB would have failed to take advantage of the streak of corruption which ran through Indian politics is simply beyond imagination. Now, all this was explained in 1994 by General Oleg Kalugin, whose book didn't sell nearly as many copies as it should have done, and perhaps now will do, in New Delhi. Or all that I hope to have done, thanks to Mitrokhin, is to provide a lot of the evidence to justify the statement in that book that India was a model of third world infiltration of a third world government. So what does it actually achieve? Now, this, of course, is the difficult one, because nobody can ever prove just how much any one individual influences another. You know, we always have to go by circumstantial evidence. This individual says that, the other person comes out, the other institution comes out with the same opinion. Producing a relationship of cause and effect is pretty difficult. So the KGB sort of were reduced to numbers. It claimed at its peak to have planted 5,500 articles in the Indian press, although it rapidly goes down. But I think we can point to a number of things, which, despite the community of strategic interest between Indira Gandhi's India and the Soviet Union, community of interest so far as China and Pakistan are concerned, delusions about the United States, which I think were externally as opposed to internally generated. Now, one obvious example, which is already known, is the AIDS active measure, which, even though it spreads across a significant part of the world, including the Sunday Express in Britain, begins in India. It's not, I think, terribly likely that the idea that AIDS begins as American biological warfare manufactured in Fort Detrick in Maryland would have been self-generated. When Mrs. Gandhi talks about the foreign hand behind her domestic unrest in Assam and the Northeast, when Rajiv Gandhi talks about definite interference from the USA in the Punjab, it is reasonable to see a connection between the forgeries that are being produced by the KGB and passed to both. That is something that is briefly mentioned in one of the things that was published by the Cold War International History Project a couple of years ago, but attracted less attention than it should have done in the subcontinent. And again, Mrs. Gandhi's continued and only slightly elliptical references to the danger of assassination by the CIA, and after I end it, when I'm killed, they will say I killed myself. There's a broader pattern to this, and there's some examples in the book, and one can see why it was so successful. The Church Committee coming out and the other reports on the assassination plots in the mid-1970s, combined with the fact, difficult to remember now, 30 years ago, a substantial majority of the American people believed that the CIA had killed John F. Kennedy, and actually I think in the mid-1980s that still continued. So from the point of view of the KGB, going up to third world leaders of its choice and saying something along the lines, even the American people realize that CIA killed Kennedy, they're surely not going to have any second thoughts about killing you as well, are they? Anyway, you'll find in the book there is the only one of these conversations that Mitrokhin noted fully is the one with Sukuture in Conakry, but I think we can conclude that that is typical of a number of others. The other big surprise to me, well, it has been a surprise over the last week to discover how much that was already on the historical record. Oleg Kalugin's memoirs come to mind, but Shabashin's and others come to mind. The material published by the Cold War International History Project is another, as how little of this material has yet penetrated to the subcontinent, and it will produce, I'm sure, and is already producing, an extremely lively exchange. What I have been surprised about is the forgetfulness of the Indian, of the Communist Party of India, which if I haven't had time to read the articles over the last week, but I understand believes itself to have been the only Communist Party of any significance which never received any subsidies from Moscow, which means that all those books that we've been reading, which always include the subsidies to the Communist Party of India in the top 10, we have to think again about, or just conceivably the Communist Party of India has to think again about. The impact on the Third World. This is a huge subject, and I've just identified in the book a number of areas for future research. One of them is that, I don't think it's been noticed before, that the KGB, and I'm calling the KGB, using the word KGB to describe Soviet intelligence apparatus in all its manifestations, from the Chekha on the 20th of December 1917 up to the fall of the Soviet Union, who became leaders of the independent Third World, has a good deal to do with whether they went to the Soviet Union in the 1920s and the early 1930s or during the Great Terror. So Ho Chi Minh, Deng Xiaoping, Jomo Kenyatta timed their visits to the Lenin School really far better than they realized at the time. That is to say, before the Great Terror. I mean, Kenyatta, for one, could not possibly have survived. Why? Because Kenyatta had a sense of humor. And when, in the early 1930s, somebody denounced him as a petty bourgeois, he replied, "Not so much of the petty, why didn't you call me a big bourgeois?" Well, the life expectancy in 1937 of anybody making that joke would certainly not be as long as 24 hours. And, if one looks at the people who perished there, names that are almost unknown now, but Albert Ndula, the first black head of the Communist Party of South Africa, amongst those who perished in the Great Terror, were, I think, a generation of Third World leaders whose names are now forgotten. The impact in the Third World on the development of the local security services, the development of the one-party state, the enormous arms imports, and in the 70s and early 80s it is more the East than the West. Looking for anything positive, I think that for the Third World I would actually pick on South Africa. At a point when the United States and the United Kingdom lacked the moral courage to support the ANC, the Soviet Union, for reasons which are perhaps not best explained by moral courage, did provide support at a time when support was not coming from elsewhere. And I'm rather inclined to agree with the conclusion of Nelson Mandela. He says this in his memoirs: "The cynical have always suggested that the communists were using us, but who is to say that we are not using them?" And those former communist ministers who are currently carrying out Thatcherite policies in South Africa under Mbeki might perhaps agree with that. So now for some conclusions. The Mitrokhin material. What I think I have gained from it is not so much information as understanding. If one looks back on the Cold War, and it doesn't matter whether one is dealing with the Cold War as described in Volume 1, Europe and the West, or Volume 2, the Third World, there is this extraordinary gulf between the quality of collection and analysis. The successes of the KGB at collection, and one of the most distinguished collectors is here today, fooled, I think, Western intelligence services into believing that the assessments which reached Soviet policymakers must be up to the level of the collection, which is not, of course, the case. Leonov, the first to see the potential of the Third World, his career takes a nosedive in 1971. Why? Because he's promoted to deputy head of assessment, which in those days was Service 1, and he describes in his memoirs as a punishment posting. Deputy head of assessment, a punishing posting? Yes, that's it, folks. That really, I think, captures the main area. He goes on to say that it was like moving from operations, which he'd been in, to analysis, was like moving from a guards regiment in the capital to a provincial garrison. Then the other thing that we need to remember, particularly in the Third World, is how much of the KGB's operations were inspired, albeit unconsciously, by Monty Python. I honestly think that's a fair description. You know, Montgomery Python never had as many medals as Brezhnev did. Brezhnev's increasingly preposterous vanity had to be fed not merely by more medals than were awarded to all previous Soviet leaders combined, but a diet of global praise, much of it manufactured by the KGB, and there are dozens of examples in the book. But there is one Mexican operation that I would like to, not quite end with, but to give as an example of the kind of thing that one doesn't normally think of intelligence communities as required to do. Khrushchev had been absolutely outraged by the fact that during his triumphal coast-to-coast tour of the United States, he'd been photographed with a bottle of Coca-Cola. And so orders went out when the Soviet cosmonauts went around the world that no Coca-Cola provocation was to take place. But in Mexico City, Tereshkova, I think that was her name, the female cosmonaut, the first female cosmonaut, was being photographed. And a local KGB officer was able to see a waiter holding a bottle of Coca-Cola moving into the background. Anyway, his career as a waiter was cut short. Right, I will conclude. How on earth to conclude is pretty difficult. I think I would emphasize just a number of things. One is denial. If one looks at what Leonov, Primakov, Shabashin, Kirpichenko, and others are saying now, they can't come to terms with all this. they say essentially, we were doing fine. We were the best. We were let down by the political system. Absolutely right. The point they find difficult to grasp is they were part of the political system. The second is, I think, continuity and change. All of us learn things from our graduate students. But I will not admit that there is anybody in the room who has learnt more from their graduate students over the last few years than I have. Now, here's what one came back with a couple of years ago. She had just been to the FSB. Most of people in this room know that the FSB is the internal successor to the KGB, the FSB church in Moscow. That's it. The FSB now has something that the CIA and British intelligence will never have. It has a parish church to administer to the neglected spiritual needs of its intelligence officers. And the summer of 1992, she brought back, God bless her, the program. Alexei II, the patriarch, turned up and consecrated this church, St. Sophia, fairly close to central Moscow, in central Moscow. And he was handed by Patrushev, the head of the FSB, the ceremonial golden keys to the church. And he handed over a couple of icons to Patrushev, which are presumably on his wall. And if that doesn't get Felix Dzerzhinsky turning in his grave, I can't think of anything that would. So the KGB FSB has now turned to the notions of spiritual security. The national security doctrine of the Russian Federation includes spiritual values. Well, again, it just shows how unpredictable the world is. Even though I think there are very few people in the United States that realize that there is at least one common element in the ideology of President Bush, President Putin, and Prime Minister Tony Blair. That is to say that they all claim to be committed Christians. The role of spirituality in current Russian intelligence is something that I still haven't come to terms with and would be very glad for guidance. But finally, I refer to some of the literature, spiritual poetry, produced by the last head, I'm not making any of this up, the last head of public relations in the FSB, which includes a series of spiritual poetry for children, including the classic Light a Candle for Me, Mama. So the world is changing. There are extraordinary elements of continuity and change, and I have freely to admit that I at least am baffled by some of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a fascinating first glimpse at this weighty volume.
Oh, the church, by the way, is there are pictures of the church and how to attend church services there. It's all in here.
I should say Chris has been enormously supportive of our efforts over the years, and in fact, a few years ago hosted a graduate student seminar at Cambridge, and been very helpful to us, in particular with a view to publishing some of the materials that went into this and the first volume. Let me just point out, Chris already referenced them. There is the Cold War Project working paper number 40, published by us in 2002, the KGB in Afghanistan. It's available for free online. You're welcome to go to our site at cwihp.org and download copies. And he also mentioned a few bits of Mitrokhin's materials in the last issue of our bulletin, that is with regard to Southwest Asia, the bulletin that's available outside. Let me, at this stage, also thank my colleague Ryan Gage, who has been enormously helpful in putting together this event. Now, we like to have a dialogue at these sessions, not just congratulate authors on their enormous accomplishments, and to get the discussion of this volume going here today, We have the distinct pleasure to welcoming back one of our own, Professor Sunil Khilnani, who is the Star Foundation Professor and Director of the South Asia Studies Program at SAIS Johns Hopkins here in Washington, D.C. He's the author of numerous articles, I won't list them all now, and several volumes, most importantly, most recently, perhaps The Idea of India. And he's currently working on a biography of Nehru, which was also his project while he was in residence here as a Wilson Center Fellow a couple of years ago. It's wonderful to have him back. We figured since this volume has created particular media and generated particular media interest in India, we'll start off with this subject and then open it up to questions and comments by all of you. Sunil?
Shall I just make my...
Whichever way you like.
I think I'll see it. Well, thank you very much, Christian. And it is very nice to be back in my old alma mater, as it were. And it's also very nice to have had the chance finally to meet Professor Andrew, because I've known his work a lot for many years. Indeed, as an undergraduate in Cambridge, I attended some of his lectures, but we'd never actually met before, so it was a particular pleasure to be on the same panel. And I'll be brief in my remarks, but I hope it may help to start some discussion. I think Professor Andrew's book it's a splendid account of the global ambitions entertained by the KGB, and also of the very uneven and differentiated effects and results of these ambitions. Its operations, the operations of the KGB in some parts of the world, at some periods, possessed a lethal, if temporary, efficacy. Parts of Latin and Central America, Cuba, which he's talked about, Chile, Nicaragua, Syria, Nasser's Egypt, and above all, Afghanistan. But there were also clearly hollow failures, and again, Professor Andrew mentioned some of these: China, Iran, Pakistan, and I think ultimately India as well. India would have been an ornament in the KGB's cap, especially after the Sino-Soviet estrangement, had they been able to win India over as it intended to, or had ambitions to do. As Professor Andrew puts it in his book, and I quote, "The Soviet leadership regarded a special relationship with India as the foundation of its South Asian policy. And in terms of resources, financial and manpower, the KGB did develop a massive presence in India. The residence there, the residency as it was called, was the largest, I think, in Asia, certainly one of the largest. And this was especially so in the post-Nehru period. And again, I quote Professor Andrew when he writes, the KGB there concentrated most operational effort during the Cold War on India." Now, as has been mentioned, the foreign hand in the singular is a well-known, indeed even cliched phrase in Indian public discourse and talk. And up to now, it's been used invariably to refer to the CIA. But I think now, with Professor Andrew's book and the earlier volumes which he mentioned, we shall have in future to talk about the foreign hands in India, the CIA and the KGB. Perhaps not quite clapping in unison, but certainly sparring with one another. I think while our understanding of the CIA's role in India is still not entirely clear, but we've come to know about things like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, funded by the CIA, in which former Indian communists like Masani played a large role, in which people like Jayaprakash Narayan also had connections to. We've also known that the US and the CIA were providing funds to help contain communists in Kerala and Bengal. A former member of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Moynihan, had written about this. But what we haven't really had until this book is the extent of disinformation filtered into India by the KGB, as well as evidence to suggest that both senior politicians and journalists were compromised. And the rumored names of these we could go into, but there have been many names rumored on the Indian side. Unfortunately, the book doesn't quite reveal the names yet, but it's partly this that has provoked such a lively debate in India. As has been mentioned, the chapters on India have attracted considerable attention. Those were the ones that were serialized in the Times in London, and there have been a series of articles, and indeed a bit of a rumpus in the Indian press. The right-wing Hindu Nationalist Party has used this information to attack the Congress and Communist parties who currently form the governing coalition in India. And it's a nice stick for use in the game that government and opposition everywhere play. And I think, one didn't get too drawn into that, but the larger point which Professor Andrew raised in his talk is absolutely right, that very little of this new information, some of which has been available, has actually filtered through into the Indian debates. And I hope that this current attention will help to do that. Yet, for all the painstaking efforts of the KGB in India, there is, I think, something reminiscent of Inspector Clouseau about the KGB officers in India. They're more comic than effective and menacing. Just by way of background, although the chapters in this book are focused on the 60s onwards, it's worth remembering that, in fact, the Soviets had a long-standing interest in India, and especially in Nehru. They had identified him early on as a potentially important nationalist figure and as an ally. And he first visited Moscow, in fact, in 1927. He watched the 10th anniversary celebrations of the revolution in Red Square. And throughout the 1930s, the Soviets sought to track his positions and indeed to influence the man whom they called the professor. In Comintern documents, Nehru is invariably referred to as the professor. And people like Paul Medat and Harry Pollitt were from time to time sent off to collar Nehru and to try and influence his thought. But Nehru, in fact, maintained an irritating independence. He refused to become a client, let alone even an unambiguous ally of the Soviet Union. After independence, the Soviets continued to be attentive. There's a wonderful moment in the autobiography of the Russian ballerina Maya Plisetskaya, who was sent to India in 1953 to dance. And Nehru, indeed never one to miss such an opportunity, invited the ballerina to dinner. And the KGB, equally never to miss such opportunities, made sure that she was accompanied to the Prime Minister's house by her KGB minder, Agent Sherbakov, who actually, I notice, makes an appearance in your index. The Agent Sherbakov sat during the entire tantalizing meal like a statue on the lookout. And Plisetskaya wrote, "He should have been stuffing his face with the free meal. They wouldn't treat you to a pilaf like this in Dzerzhinsky Square," she writes. When afterwards her minder immediately came up to her and asked her what had Nehru said over dinner, she taunted him that Nehru had asked, why was the minder not eating? Was he fasting a la Gandhi? Nehru was also very well aware that the Soviets were funneling money to the Communist Party of India. Indeed, he put this fact head-on in a meeting with Khrushchev and Bulganin when they met in Delhi in December 1955. And indeed, he gave them a bit of a grilling. Nehru pointed out that Communist Party of India leaders were making secret passportless visits to the Soviet Union, and that the CPI, the Communist Party of India, was getting considerable amounts of money from outside India. And when Khrushchev squirmed, denied, and then indeed lied, Nehru again came back to the point in this conversation and insisted about money flowing in. And as Professor Andrew notes in his book, until the 1960s, in fact, the Indian Intelligence Bureau under B.N. Malik had pretty effectively penetrated the Communist Party of India. And I think this was a combination of the legacy of the information and techniques inherited from the British Raj, who had a very close feel on the communists, as well as Nehru's own anxieties about communism. But in the 1960s, it's certainly the case that the KGB become much more active, and their targets include embassy officials in Moscow, the Communist Party, and indeed Congress politicians and newer recruits to the Congress who were coming in from the late 60s onwards. And in a sense, India, being a democracy, was an easy target, but it was also deceptively easy. It was easy to penetrate aspects of the democratic system, the political parties, the free press, but at the same time, because it was a decentralized system, one could never be sure of the efficacy of the person or channel one was dealing with. It was also easy, and I think Professor Andrew makes this very point strongly and clearly, that particularly from the 1970s onwards, there was an increasing corruptibility of public figures. And I think there is a particular explanation for this, which has to do with the shifting nature of how political parties were funded in India. But this isn't a time to go into that. But certainly this makes Congress politicians much more able to be bought. I just want briefly to return to the case, in time at least, to the case of Krishna Menon, because I think this is a very interesting one. Since both the U.S. and the Soviet Union saw him as a crucial figure in their designs. And as Professor Andrew notes in the book, in May 1962, the Soviet Presidium authorized the KGB in New Delhi to build Menon up as a possible successor to Nehru. He was particularly in their good books because he just made sure that the Indian Army purchased MiG-21s rather than British airplanes. But it's also possible to know now just how determined the Americans were to get Menon out of Nehru's cabinet, and how hard they played and pushed particularly during the October-November crisis and war between China and India. Late in the month, Galbraith wrote secretly to his president, secretly and typically in the phrasing to his president, and I quote, "Note, the elimination of Menon is a vital stop to getting reconciliation with Pax, by which I set great store. I do not like Menon, but would emphasize no personal animus is guiding this strategy, even though personal animus is not wholly foreign to my nature." Within days, Menon was out of the cabinet, and Soviet efforts after that to rebuild his career proved fruitless. And it's very interesting, I think, now to have both sides of these sorts of events to be able to look at. Just a couple of points in conclusion. The longue durée, I think Professor Andrew mentioned that perspective, and one of the things that this book made me think about was a book by a Cambridge friend and colleague of ours, Chris Bailey, on empire and information in India, which traces how the British Raj in the 19th century created a vast archive of knowledge and information on India. Indeed, a kind of knowledge state. And the British had to rely entirely on native informants to develop this. And one of the things that Bailey points out in that is how these native informants fed the British either what the British wanted to hear or what they wanted the British to hear. And in a way, we're using them in a quite interesting way. And I thought there were many resonances in this account. Finally, was the KGB effective in India? I think on the evidence here, at least in India, the answer is not really. As Professor Andrew notes, like all good professional bureaucracies, they inflated their importance. In the case of India, take for example the emergency in the mid-1970s and the elections that Mrs. Gandhi called in 1977 to end the emergency. They got this massively wrong. And I'm reminded a bit of these great structures built on the British coast at the time of the First World War, the sound mirrors, the great stone contraptions which the British built after the outbreak of World War I, but before the use of radar. And these were like satellite dishes, and they were designed to gather in the noise of approaching enemy aircraft and feed them into stethoscopes and into the ears of alert security personnel to be able to tell when planes were coming over. But in fact, it was a useless technology, since all the sounds blurred into one another. It kind of yielded a sonic soup in which no single element could be identified. So you couldn't tell whether it was a Zeppelin or a motorbike that was coming along. And I think that's what in a sense, the Indian experience was. But I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Professor Andrew is a hard act to follow. I think we just saw, however, that it can be done. And now it's the floor is open to you for question and answers. If you could please identify yourself. I'd like to welcome all of you over here. Sorry, Ryan.
Two related questions, if I may. One, did these KGB files that this chap collected ever go into failures? Things we tried, but they didn't work very well. And related to that, Did these files ever say anything about CIA counter efforts in Delhi? Because I've been told, supposedly on good authority, that trolling for Russians was CIA's principal responsibility, or task, if you will, in Delhi in the 70s, maybe at other times too.
Chris, sure.
There are plenty of failures, but let me give one which brings together my own university.